How's it going, everybody? Back here again for another tier list video. We have another solid weekend of challenges along with a showcase challenge and some prelims to look at for our data for this week. Once again, gonna go through the list of all the tiers. We're gonna go through what each tier means as well as the decks that are in there and where they were last week. Before we get into that, be sure to check out all the links below this video, including a link to my Discord, which has just opened up. We have quite a few people in there talking Pioneer regularly, as well as go and check out my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/darthjacen. I stream every Monday and Thursday at 10:30 p.m. Eastern. We're closing in on 500 followers over there, and for 500 followers, we'll be doing a 10-hour Pioneer stream, so be sure to go follow over there. Now, just like last week, let's jump in with the FNM Tier. Once again, these are decks that I think are not very competitively viable, but for your local meta might work out well. You'll see them go up on these lists as a one of, maybe just in a prelim, maybe doing well in one challenge, but I don't think these are decks to take to high level events right now. Those are going to be Esper Greasefang, which I think is the worst of the three Greasefangs, despite showing up somewhat frequently in these results. It was only realistically one pilot, a very good pilot on Esper Greasefang to be fair, but I think Esper is the weakest of the three builds right now. You could argue that Esper and Abzan are very close, but I think that Mardu is the best of the three by a pretty wide margin, and I think that is the one to consider if you're playing a Greasefang deck. Next up is Jeskai Ascendancy combo. I think that this is a deck that will continue to show up here and there. It does well in certain metas. I think its biggest problem is that against Blue-White Control, Lotus Field, and Winota, it can be a turn too slow. Though you do have a reasonable matchup against most of the mid-range decks, I don't think it's where you want to be right now. Jumping into the D tier decks, these are decks that don't realistically, in my opinion, have a chance to regularly top 16 the challenges or big events this weekend. These are decks that might show up periodically, but when you look at the scope of the results, all of the challenges we look at, all the prelims, the showcases, everything, they don't show up regularly. They can still spike, they can still win events, but I don't think they are good choices and are more likely to leave you outside of the top 16. First up, we're looking at 5-color humans. Again, this is a deck that has continued to slide down. It was C tier last week in my tier list, and I think unfortunately it continues to show very few results. What results it show are inconsistent, and outside of Max McVitie winning the SCG Con team event with it, it continues to underperform week after week. I think that even the week that it did very well and won the SCG, it didn't really show up, and we had the most results of any one weekend for that tier list, and it showed up just at SCG. Outside of that, it doesn't seem to do very well in the challenges, doesn't show up in the prelims, and I think it is a deck that is not well suited right now. It might get something in the future, but for right now, it does not show up enough the highest tables. Next up, we have 4-color Transmogrify. This remains in D tier from last week. I think the Transmogrify decks are reasonable, but Agent of Treachery doesn't go as over the top as it used to, in that other decks like Blue-White Control, Lotus Field, Winota, Phoenix can still win even after you've resolved your big Transmogrify, and I don't think these decks have a consistent enough way to guarantee a win even when your main game plan works. Next up, continuing its downward slide, much like humans, we have Mono Green Karn. This was C tier last week, and I think it is moving down to D tier. I think that as people get more used to this deck, as the sideboard options prove to be less effective against the top decks, especially with Lotus Field picking up a Seiju, I think that Mono Green Karn does not have a great matchup into Phoenix, Control, or Lotus Field, and that is a very tough place to be. I think you have a reasonable matchup into some of the other high tier decks, but I think even so, you're not very likely to want to play anything in the A to B tier range very reliably, with maybe Mono Red Aggro being the only higher tier deck you would like to see. Even then, questionable. Next up, we have a new deck, which is a new take on an old style, and that is Red-Black Bloodhall Priest. It is sort of taking the Red-Black Blood deck and adding Bloodhall Priest, going a little bit bigger since the ban of Luris. We've seen Ekros finish top 8 with it in the challenge. It continues to show up here and there, making top 8s of challenges. I think this is an interesting development for Black-Red Blood that had kind of fallen in the wayside to Red-Black Oni Cult. I think this is the direction that Blood will head in the future, and I think it has potential, but again, I don't think it beats out either of the the other red-black decks that were already on the list, nor another new addition that is a little higher up right now. Next up, we're going to move to C tier. These are the decks that I would not be surprised to see top 16ing, but they are still unlikely to be your top 8 contenders. I think these are decks that are well positioned if the meta breaks the right way, but in an open field event like a challenge, a showcase, or a PTQ, I would not want to be bringing these decks. First up, we have a new addition as that red-black deck we mentioned, as red-black Arcanist, coming back from having fallen off with the ban of Luris as well as the rise of Onicult Anvil and red-black midrange. Red-black Arcanist has put up some results recently and continues to look promising as people start rebuilding the shell, much like Onicult Anvil, post Luris, and figuring out where the deck wants to go now. Next up, we have Mono Blue Spirits, which retains its spot in the C tier. This is a deck that again preys on decks that want to have high cost spells in their deck. You get low to the ground traction with your 1-drops, followed up with interaction through spells, as well as more Spirit Lords and ways to interact. Overall, you're not in a great spot against most of the aggro decks or decks that have cheap interaction. I also don't think you're particularly well suited against Winota or Phoenix, though you do have a pretty good matchup into Blue-Eye Control and Lotus Field. You are sort of hoping to hit the right side of the equation and not the wrong side, and I don't think this is a deck that, outside of the hands of a very select few, will be likely to be cracking the top 8 often. Next up, retaining its C tier spot as well is Mardu Greasefang, the best of the Greasefang decks. This is a deck that I think takes the red-black blood package and adds in a combo element. It is very weak to Rest in Peace and Graveyard Hate. If it had a little bit more resilience or had the access to Boseiju, I think you would have a lot better chance of having this move higher, but as it is, due to the presence of Phoenix using the graveyard so aggressively, I think it is difficult to get through the Graveyard Hate that exists in the format for this deck, and even though it is the best of the Greasefang decks, I don't think Greasefang is a deck that is likely to get you all that high up in the challenge often, even though it did win the challenge this weekend, and that is a big part of what keeps it in the C tier, despite not having a great weekend elsewhere. Next up, we move to B tier. These are decks that I think, depending on how the meta breaks, could very well win any challenge, but if you are looking at them against the S and A tiers, they are less likely to be favored in those matchups. A big part of that comes down to the prevalence of the S tier decks right now, and that is what's holding most of these decks back from moving up. In the B tier, we have Red-Black Midrange, another example of a deck that manages to prey on the low to the ground aggressive decks and struggles with some of the higher CMC decks that can top deck out of their answers. While you do have a reasonable game against most decks, as most mid-range decks do by alternating your plans post sideboard, you still can't really make up the percentage against most of the top tier decks. And while you do beat up on Winota very well, you struggle again into Blue-White Control and Lotus Field if you're not able to get a very quick start, discarding and backing it up with your Planeswalker. Next up, we have Bant Spirits, another Spirits variant. I think this version is slightly higher. It was C tier, last week. And I think the reason that Bant Spirits moves up is that, again, being able to attack Lotus Field, Blue-Eye Control, and being able to prey on some of the smaller aggro decks helps it a lot. It came in second in the challenge that Mardu Greasefang won, and also managed to show up a few more times, including in the showcase. While it doesn't have the strongest finishes right now, I think as the meta continues to move towards spell-based decks, it will continue to be a good choice. Next up in B tier, we have Mono Red Aggro, which has fallen down from A tier. While this deck did win the Super PTQ, was one of the 2 slots, I think this deck mostly preys on the clunkiness of Lotus Field's draws, as well as some of the other high mana cost spell-based decks. I think if the meta shifts slightly, which is what I anticipated would happen for the Super, Mono Red is not well positioned. Mono Red managed to take one of the PTQ slots, but I think otherwise it was mostly beaten out from decks that had the opportunity to answer it. I think Mono Red is still a very good deck, but I think people are adjusting to it quickly. Next up are the A tier decks. These are decks that I would not be surprised at all to win a challenge. They are likely to top 8, and I think if you're not prepared for them, you are likely leaving a lot of equity on the table. First up, formerly B tier last week, and that is Red-Black Onicult. Jabberwocky continues to dominate with this deck. It continues to pick up steam and show why it was so prevalent with Luris, now continuing to battle back the likes of Mono Red Aggro, as well as having a good fighting sideboard against all of the top tier decks. While it does struggle against the speed of Lotus Field, it does have good staying power against almost every other top tier deck. While it isn't quite at the point where I'd put it S tier, it continues to creep back up towards where it was before the Luris ban. Next up, we have Winota falling down from S tier for the first time in a very long time. A big reason for that is the prevalence of the red-black decks being able to interact with your Winotas on the turn they enter, as well as having a bad matchup into blue-red Phoenix and blue-white control. I think Lotus Field cannot beat you likely with Winota on your best draws, but your more average draws are also a little too slow. This makes it very difficult for you to finish ahead of these decks that are so prevalent, as well as putting up more consistent finishes. Next up, we have the S tier. These are the decks that are your favorites to win any event this weekend. They continue to put up great results. They continue to win events, put up top 8s, and frankly, if you are not aware of how these decks operate, you are severely likely to lose to them, especially with bigger events coming back. These are decks you need to understand how they work, as well as their place in the meta. First up, we have blue-red Phoenix, which won one of the Super PTQ slots, as well as putting up 7 top finishes this last weekend. While most of them did come from various areas, they do still continue to show up in large numbers and top 8 events regularly. I think Phoenix continues to be a deck that can be adjusted to beat anything in the meta, and is definitely gated mostly by deck building considerations, as we see divergences of how many trespasses versus treasure cruises versus which threats to play, thing in the ice, no thing in the ice, more Phoenixes, sideboard young pyromancers. We're seeing a divergence again of the builds that will lead to a continued evolution of what Phoenix build is best against the current meta. Next up, we have blue-white control. Both the 60 and the 80 card Yorion versions did very well, including winning the showcase and putting up a top 4. Blue-white continues to be a dominating force. Having played it in the Super PTQ myself, this deck is very good, especially in game 1s, and if you're able to adequately sideboard for the meta, you are able to have a huge advantage on the rest of the format. Finally, our newest S tier deck, formerly A tier, is Lotus Field. It continues to put up monstrous results in every challenge, showcase, and prelim. It continues to put up a top 8 in the Super PTQ and a 9th place. It still does very well into most decks in the format, struggling most into the best draws out of Winota, as well as some of the tempo-based decks like Bant Spirits that can counter some of your important spells while applying pressure, along with Mono Red Aggro's Rise that certainly puts a lot of speed and pressure onto Lotus Field. Your best matchups being blue-white control, as well as being able to beat up any of the mid-range decks that aren't quite fast enough. I think Lotus Field is a deck that continues to show its place in the meta and will continue to be a top deck in the format regardless of what goes on, especially with the printing of Beseju, Otawara, and having Blast Zone as tutorable answers for all of the permanent based hate in the format. So with that, we are concluded with our tier list. Be sure to check out the links down below, as I already said. If you want access to these tiers early, the written version of these tier lists come out on my Patreon every Monday, so be sure to check out that down below. Hey there. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed this content on either Twitch or YouTube. If you did, please like or subscribe. If you didn't, be sure to leave a comment down below. I promise not to read it. Until next time.